Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through the scriptures for April the 17th. Today your readings were Joshua chapters 16, 17, and 18, Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 27, Psalm 87, 1 through 7, and Proverbs chapter 13, verse 11. Now today's conversation is going to be brought to you by the word sin. And it's going to be brought around with a question. How do you deal with sin? Now, we're going to see two examples of how people deal with sin in today's conversation. And one of them is going to come in the book of Joshua, and the other one's going to come in the book of Luke with a fairly famous wee little tale. But let's go over to Joshua chapter 17 first. Now, we're going to look at what would be probably an inconsequential couple of verses until you start to realize that it is much like a snowball rolling downhill. It's going to get worse, and it's going to get bigger. So in Joshua chapter 17, starting in verse 12, it's talking about the tribe of Manasseh, okay? And this is during the conquest of Israel by the Israelites, what would become Israel by the Israelites. And Joshua, God gave them very clear instructions that Joshua passed on, saying we need to eradicate all of the other peoples. Don't let them stay among you, because if you do, it's going to cause problems. So, in chapter 12, it says, yet the Manassites were not able to occupy these towns, talking about towns that they were trying to conquer, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that region. However, when the Israelites grew stronger, they subjected the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. Now, this is one way that we deal with sin. We compromise. Okay, God gave very clear instructions to the people of Israel. And while the readers of this back then, this was not written, for the record, Joshua was not necessarily written right after the time of Joshua. This was written many, many, many years later, potentially even as late as when Israel was exiled. And these were reminders of God's deliverance and God's provision. But when you look at this, you think, what's the big deal? They let a few people hang out there. Well, God warned them. And as a matter of fact, the consequences are going to come really to light in the book of Judges. Because God told them, He said, if you allow these people to stay around, they will corrupt you. They will begin to influence you and show you ways and allow you to compromise. And the next thing you know, their gods will become your gods, and you will forget the one true God. See, this is how sin affects us. Sin, if we are not careful, can continue to chip away at us. If we let even just a little bit of sin, if we abide in sin just a little bit, it can completely chip away at us. And the next thing we know, we have completely forgotten who we are as children of God. The people of Israel faced major consequences because they compromised. They were willing to look at it and go, it's not a big deal. Instead of looking at it and going, no, God warned us about this. We need to take this seriously. Sin is just like that. If we allow small sins into our lives, for example, we allow ourselves as men, we're visual creatures. If we allow ourselves to look lustfully at a woman, we begin to objectify women. And then we begin to allow cracks to appear. And the next thing you know, we are completely stuck in either an adulterous relationship, or we're stuck in addiction to things like pornography. If we allow a small sliver in, it continues to widen, much like water in a crack. It starts as a small crack, but as the water persistently goes, it will eventually destroy the entire dam. Contrast that with Luke chapter 19 and the story of Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus is a man who understands life change, and he goes above and beyond because he recognizes what Jesus does for him is worth giving up everything for. When Jesus reached the spot in verse 5, he looked up and said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house. And of course, in verse 7, the people start muttering, he's gone into the house of a sinner. But Zacchaeus, in verse 8, said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Zacchaeus is not willing to go just halfway or part way. He's going to go all of the way because he understands exactly what Jesus is doing for him. He understands the life change that following Jesus brings. We cannot allow sin to creep into our lives. We need to be like Zacchaeus, completely sold out, going above and beyond. Sometimes it might take extreme measures on our part. Jesus uses another analogy in another part of Scripture where he says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. He's not necessarily saying literally. He's saying, though, we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to guard ourselves against the small cracks of sin that become destroyers of lives. Okay, there you go. There's our conversation for today. We'll talk more tomorrow.